Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old, an anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. A little over 18 months ago, we did a show with Uri Kaufman, the author of a very well-reviewed book, 18 Days in October, the Yom Kippur War and How It Created the Modern Middle East. It's got almost 200 positive reviews on Amazon. And in our conversation with Kaufman, Uri compared the Yom Kippur War of October 1973 with what he called the Simchat Torah War of October 2023. Well, I'm pleased that Uri Kaufman is back with a new book. It's out this week. It's called American Intifada, American Israel, the Gaza War, and the New Anti-Semitism. It's not a history book. It's more of a polemic. And Uri is joining us. He just cracked. How many ribs did you crack, Uri?
5.
Well, congratulations. We appreciate your bravery coming on the show in spite of the 5 cracked ribs you got on the ice rink playing ice hockey. Maybe a lesson, Uri. Maybe time to retire from ice hockey.
You can't say that to me. You're not my wife.
Okay, well, I'm not your wife, but I am your interviewer and maybe your analyst. Explain how you went from this historical book on the Yom Kippur War of 1973 to this new polemic, American Intifada, Israel, the Gaza War, and the new anti-Semitism.
Well, it had to do largely with the reaction to the October 7 attack. One person who tweeted, for example, was Barack Obama. And he said that we must face facts that there are unclean hands on both sides. Why unclean hands on both sides? Well, he told us why, because of what President Obama termed the unbearable occupation. There was just one small problem. There was no occupation of Gaza. Israel had withdrawn from Gaza almost 20 years before. The New York Times similarly referred to Gaza as being under occupation, even though Israel had withdrawn from it, which is, of course, nonsensical. If you had I went to the search bar of Amnesty International. This was in May of 2024. I typed in the word rape, and 2,632 hits came back. Rape in Darfur, rape in Rwanda, rape in every corner of planet Earth. There was just one place where there was no mention of rape, and that was Israel in the October 7 attack, even though many of the Hamas terrorists have acknowledged that they raped Israeli women. A number of Israeli women courageously stepped forward. Then I went back and I typed in Hamas rape, and only one hit came back. It was a Palestinian woman accusing Israel of having threatened her with rape. So it got me wondering, why are people saying so many things about Israel that are absolutely nonsensical? And from out of that came this book.
Actually, I've just typed, as you were speaking, Hamas rape into my search engine, and I get a lot of stuff, but
well, did you search Amnesty International, though? That's the question.
Well, let's talk. I know you make a big thing of Obama. I'm not in the business of defending him. He can defend himself. But I did look at some of his other tweets, and he makes it clear, Obama, that and some people might describe this as both-siderism, that he's concerned both with the terrible pain of Israelis, and I'm quoting him here from X, whose loved ones were butchered or abducted by Hamas, or the Palestinians whose families have been shattered by the subsequent war. Isn't it the moral obligation of someone like Obama, who clearly has no particular dog in this fight, to be concerned about both sides?
So let's try to put this in a proper context. Imagine we're closing in on Berlin. We fought this horrible, hideous war, many, many, many lives lost. And then someone says, you know, we really need to stop the war. Too many innocent German civilians have been harmed. They're suffering. We can't have this.
So you're jumping into the Hitler analogy, which Uri is slightly absurd. Are you suggesting that that Hamas is equivalent to the Nazis?
Yeah. They say the Jews are apes and pigs and they want to commit genocide like Hitler. And those who doubt me, just go on Google, type in Jews, apes, and pigs, or Palestine, apes, and pigs. Scroll with your mouse. You'll see what I'm saying is true. More to the point, I'm not aware of any war anywhere, even a more recent one. Like, for example, well, when President Obama, and I can say Prime Minister David Cameron of Britain, decided to destroy ISIS. It's known as Operation Inherent Resolve. I don't remember anyone then saying, well, we need to stop in the middle. Too many innocent civilians in Islam.
Well, but let's go back. I mean, there's a lot here, but let's go back. So are you suggesting that Obama, in talking about being concerned of the Palestinians whose lives, and I'm quoting him here, whose families have been shattered by the subsequent war, that he shouldn't have written that? You should only be concerned about the terrible pain of Israelis whose loved ones, and I'm again quoting him, were butchered and abducted by Hamas. He makes it very clear. I mean, as I said, I don't want to make this just a conversation about Obama, but you use him as kind of exhibit A in your book. So I was interested in your response to that.
Well, I'm using him as exhibit A because he said something that was just patently false.
Well, he made a mistake. I mean, again, I'm not in the business of defending Obama, but it's conceivable that he made an error. And it might have been, you're analyzing it historically. I think in his mind, perhaps there was more of a metaphorical element in the Palestinians being prisoners in Gaza, quote unquote, prisoners being more metaphorical than literal. But anyway, I mean, what should Obama have said? I mean, isn't this fair that he's concerned with the human suffering on both sides?
Well, you know what he should have said is what he said and what Michelle Obama said when the attackers were Boko Haram and they kidnapped the girls and they said, bring back our girls. And there was no, moral equivalency, and there was no whataboutism, and there was no what about the suffering.
But again, I mean, is this moral equivalency to be concerned with Palestinians whose families have been shattered by the subsequent war? Is that in your view moral equivalency?
It certainly is moral equivalence when you say there's unclean hands on both sides because of the occupation, and there's no occupation. They withdrew. It's certainly moral equivalency when you say there's unclean hands on both sides. And again, put this into any context you like. I mean, maybe the World War II context is an unfair one. I don't think it is. But to say, well, there's unclean hands on both sides. Look what all the things Britain did to Germany in World War I or something like that. Most people would say that's just plain ridiculous. If you said that when Barack Obama, and just to remind people, back in the day, the United States provided 70% of the air power, Britain 20%, and then Canada, Australia, and France the other 10%. This is against Islamic State. So you had a perfect statement of all the enlightened countries of the world, and they blew Islamic State off the map, one city at a time. The Rand Corporation wrote a history of the war. It's called Operation Inherent Resolve. It's on the internet. They wrote it for the Defense Department. Anyone can read it. They just described the city of Mosul as effectively destroyed. 2 American colonels estimated the damage at over $100 billion. Over 40,000 civilians were killed. They deliberately bombed the main hospital there. It's called the Salem Hospital. None of this is in controversy. CENTCOM issued a...
Well, I mean, I think it is. I think there are many people, lots of books have been written about the morality of the war, but the war in the Gulf, and the war in Iraq. And so that's another subject. Let's get to the core issue in your book. It's called American Intifada. It's not a book about Hamas. It's a book about what you call the new anti-Semitism. So let's understand how would you define anti-Semitism? I went on your favorite place, the internet, to look up anti-Semitism on Wikipedia. And I'm quoting, anti-Semitism is hostility or prejudice toward or discrimination against Jews. Is what you see coming out of this Gaza war, is this a new anti-Semitism? What's new about it?
what's new is, and you're right, new anti-Semitism is almost an oxymoron because what could be older than that? But what's new is this anti-Semitism is paved with the best of intentions. It's nothing like the old, and many of the people who practice it do so unwittingly, and they don't have any of the other characteristics of an anti-Semite. So, I mean, for example, Barack Obama was surrounded by Jewish aides. Kamala Harris.
You keep on talking about Obama. I think we got to get beyond him because,
okay,
as I said,
you're right. I agree with you. The best way to understand this, what I call new anti-Semitism, is to engage in a thought experiment. So go back to the October 7 attack. 1,200 people murdered, totally unprovoked attack, many women raped. The Palestinian public supported it universally, according to every opinion poll. They regularly refer to Jews as apes and pigs, as I said. One more fact.
Again, you're stretching things there, but go on.
Okay, the Biden administration budgeted billions of dollars to rebuild Gaza for what they would term the innocent civilians. Fair enough. So now let's engage in a thought experiment. Let's assume every one of those facts happened exactly the way they did. Let's just change one fact. Let's assume the attackers were not Palestinians. Let's assume they were Germans of another era, or, I don't know, white South Africans of another era. In other words, let's assume they were white people who said Jews are apes and pigs, not Arabs. Do you really think the Biden administration would have budgeted billions of dollars for the white supremacist innocent civilians? And let's just hold the thought for a moment. Now let's carry this all the way through. Let's assume, again, in this parallel universe, white supremacists instead of Arab supremacists, but they murdered 1,200 black people and they raped black women. And then a Republican administration said, you know, we're going to give billions of dollars to the innocent white supremacist civilians who say that blacks are apes and pigs. They'd be rioting in this.
Well, yeah, again, this kind of argument, though, is slightly silly, Uri, in my view. I mean, it's one thing you're connecting this apes and pigs idea with resistance against what some people, what is universally, or most people would agree, is a kind of occupation, whether it's the West Bank or Gaza or symbolic. So not everyone who is against Israel's power in the Middle East believes that Jews are apes and pigs. One can separate those two things, can't one?
Well, you can, sure. I mean, I certainly would never suggest that any Western...
Well, you are suggesting that because you're suggesting that anyone who somehow is against Israel believes that Jews are apes and pigs.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying the Palestinians...
You are, because you keep on saying the same thing in the same sentence. I'm
saying the Palestinians have said it many, many times. By the way, the reason they say it is there is a verse in the Quran that says it, that the Jews are sons of apes and pigs.
Now you're suggesting that all Muslims are... I mean, Muslims are Semites too, of course.
Andrew, you got to let me finish. What I'm saying is radical Islamists who take it literally, they say this, and they do believe this. And I'm not the only one who says this. There are many moderate Muslims who do not believe this, and I take them at their word. It's fine. But there are many people who are radical Islamists, like Hamas, for example, like Hezbollah, and they do take this literally, and they do say this. And they do believe Jews are subhuman, and that's not what I say. It is what they say.
Right, and that's not the... Let's be clear here. Your book is not a critique of Hezbollah or Hamas. It's a book about what you call this new anti-Semitism, which has been, so to speak, unleashed after the Gaza war. You use Obama as an example. Could you give me some other examples of liberals in your mind who have used a kind of moral equivalency, a hypocritical moral equivalency in their critique of Israel?
So first of all, Jimmy Carter, when he was president, was one of only two presidents who took a position more anti-Israel than the Arabs did. The big issue in the 1970s was a word called linkage. Linkage meaning that every issue is linked to the Palestinians, because the Palestinians wouldn't make peace. No one else in the Arab world would make peace either. Anwar Sadat told the Israelis in a private meeting he would make peace even without the Palestinians. He just wanted to get back to Sinai Peninsula. So seemingly the pathway was open for a deal. The problem was Jimmy Carter said, but I need a Palestinian state. Now stop and think about that for a moment. Imagine Ukraine and Russia arrived at some sort of understanding for a deal, and an American president said, no, wait, that's not good enough. I have other issues. I want you to resolve, I don't know, some issue with the former.
So are you suggesting that Carter was anti-Semitic and he himself was manifesting what you call this new anti-Semitism?
I'm saying he's manifesting that, and all of his aides. I'm not the only one who noticed this. His aides all said it stemmed from the same thing.
Okay, but you keep on that. That's an argument that's not convincing. Or you keep on saying, I'm not the only one who says it. That doesn't suggest anything one way or the other. Let's talk about some people who are alive. Carter died last year, and he was very old when he died. He was no longer really a relevant player in international politics. Could you give some other examples of people who are suffering from what you call this new anti-Semitism beyond Obama?
Well, first of all, it was Carter's own aides who said this, but putting that aside, let's talk about institutions. The New York Times. The New York Times said in, I think it was September the 20th, 2007, that Gaza was under Israeli military occupation, even though Israel withdrew. Now, that's just nonsensical, okay? Under international law, you're only an occupier if you are there. It's something they call the Hague Convention of 1907. And it says black on white, you're not an occupier unless you're there. To argue that is just ridiculous.
Okay, so again, are you suggesting that the New York Times is an anti-Semitic newspaper?
Well, I'm saying they're engaging in the new anti-Semitism because I don't think they would do this if the people of Israel were people of color and the people of Gaza were the white people. The New York Times also said that Gaza was under what they termed a draconian blockade. So I looked it up. In the year 2022, the last full year before the attack, Israel supplied Gaza with 67,000 trucks filled with supplies, food, clothing, baby formula, you name it, 5.7 billion gallons of water, 2/3 of Gaza's electricity, all of its fuel. They got to pay for this. So 17,000 Gazan Palestinians had licenses to work in Israel and bring home a paycheck. So far from a draconian blockade, it was the only war in the history of the world where one side was supplying the other. Lord knows we never supplied our enemies in any of our wars, neither did Britain. So to call that a draconian blockade is nonsensical. And to argue that
I take your point, and maybe there is, well, I mean, not maybe. I mean, there's clearly some degree of hypocrisy on all sides. But why is that anti-Semitic?
Well, anytime you discriminate against Jews, I don't think it's unreasonable to call it anti-Semitism. Now, don't misunderstand. Again, I'm not saying that they are classic anti-Semites like the medieval church calling Jews Christ killers, or certainly the Nazis. It is driven by something else. It is driven by an over-identification with people of color. And if we were talking about the legacy of Jim Crow, of slavery, of apartheid, we'd probably find a lot of common ground. But this fact pattern is totally different. The problem is they're so used to siding with people of color against, in this case, not just white people, but Jews, who in their minds are a white group of privilege. They're so used to siding with people of color against a white group of privilege that they fall into form. And then when the facts don't don't make sense, they change the facts to fit the narrative because of something called...
Well, you keep on talking about they. You mentioned Obama, in my view at least, it seems very balanced on this. You talked about the New York Times, which it's hard to imagine this as an anti-Semitic newspaper. Could you give me some other examples of people who are suffering from this new anti-Semitism? Well-meaning liberals who get it wrong, who confuse Palestinians with American slaves.
Perfect example, one you'll appreciate as a British citizen. In the 1990s, we had two peace processes operating on parallel tracks. Northern Ireland, right? There was the Downing Street Declaration in December of 93, and Oslo, which was in September of 1993. When it came to the Northern Ireland peace process, everything was governed by something known as the Mitchell Principles, named after George Mitchell, who was the Senate Majority Leader until he left the Senate and he became the special presidential envoy for Northern Ireland. The Mitchell Principles said, no violence. There will be no excuses. Anyone who engages in violence is out of the peace process. No excuses, no second chances. You're out. That's it. And they kept to it. So when the Irish Republican Army set off a bomb in London that murdered 2 people, they were out and they stood by that. And then they eventually, when they agreed to give up violence, they came back. The same was true of several Protestant groups. But then in the Oslo peace process, the suicide bombing started almost immediately. The Palestinians sent 250.
Uri, you're not answering my question. The subtitle of your book is Israel, the Gaza war, and the new anti-Semitism. And of course, you're giving an example of something that happened way before the Gaza war. So give me some contemporary examples beyond Obama of people who are suffering today since Gaza from this new anti-Semitism.
Well, if I can just finish the example, when it came to Israel,
I know, but you've just written a whole book about it. You must have other examples apart from Obama.
Well, I'm not even talking about Obama, but if you want to talk about more recently, the BBC, okay, consistently using the Gaza Health Ministry numbers, even though they've been shown by statisticians in 7 different studies that they're nonsensical. The U.S. Congress voted by a lopsided majority of almost 2-1 to ignore them in the State Department reports because they are ridiculous. When the Palestinians said that the total number of killed was 14,000, Lucy Hawkins, who was, as you well know, is a very well-known news presenter on the BBC, said 14,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed by Israel. Not even Hamas said that. They said 14,000 total.
Okay, but that's a statistical issue. I mean, I looked up the casualties of the Gaza war on Wikipedia in preparation for this, and what I read, and I'm quoting, and people watching can see the screen, as of 8th April 2025, over 52,000 people, 50,810 Palestinian and 1,706 Israelis have been reported killed in the Gaza war. Is that anti-Semitic?
It's not
Uri?
anti-Semitic for the Gaza Health Ministry to engage in propaganda. By the way, it says, according to the official figures of the Gaza Health Ministry. The problem was the official figures of the Gaza Health Ministry have been shown time and again to be nonsensical. If you recall, when there was that rocket attack on October the 17th, right after the October 7 attack, it landed on the parking lot of the Al-Ahli Hospital. And right away, the Gaza Health Ministry said 571 Palestinian civilians were killed by Israel. Now, the people who do this for a living looked and said, that's impossible. You couldn't have pulled 571 bodies within 2 hours. But everyone in the news media carried it. It turned out that the people were killed not by an Israeli rocket, but by an Islamic Jihad rocket that malfunctioned. And it turned out later, at least according to the Wall Street Journal, that fewer than 50 people were killed in that parking lot. Again, not by Israel, but by a Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So right then and there, the Gaza Health Ministry was shown just to lie.
So are you suggesting these numbers are just wrong?
And in fact, they've been shown wrong time and again. There was a study in it's right up there, OHCHR. The UN did a study and found that fully a third of the number of the people who the health ministry said were dead were unaccounted for. So when the nonsense number was 34,000, 12,000, there were no names. They just said people died. Who died?
Well, that's still a lot of people. You're not answering my question. You mentioned, I said, okay, you talked about the New York Times being anti-Semitic. Now you're talking about the BBC. I'm asking for individuals. I mean, the subtitle of your book is The New Anti-Semitism. So there must be people you use as examples. I mean, one person who comes to mind is Peter Beinart, an American Jew who's been very outspoken on what's happening in Gaza. He's written a book about what the war in Gaza reveals about American Judaism. In your view, is Beinart himself, who is an Orthodox Jew, for better or worse, is he an example of this new anti-Semitism?
I don't know a whole lot about Peter Beinart, to be perfectly honest, but let me talk about someone I do. Agnes Callamard, the executive director of Amnesty International, has a long history of saying absolutely nutty things about Israel. For example, she said that Shimon Peres, his former Israeli prime minister, had acknowledged in an interview with the New York Times, says Agnes Callamard, that Israel had assassinated Yasser Arafat. Okay, he never said it. Everyone went through the New York Times. There was no such interview. It never happened. It was so bad that Amnesty International disassociated itself from its own executive director's remarks. You look at Amnesty International also claimed that Israel was an apartheid state at a time when an Arab party was part of the government. In fact, it was Israel's Islamic Party that was part of the government. Many other nutty statements by Amnesty International.
Well, let me ask you about this woman then, and I don't know that much about her. Can one, and this seems to be the key question, Uri, in these kinds of conversations, can one be critical of Israel without being anti-Semitic?
Of course you can. I'm critical.
Can you give me some examples of people?
I'm critical of Israel all the time. Israel has a judicial system that's completely out of control. I've argued it's actually white minority rule. It's not apartheid because it's not premised on racism. It's like a liberal variant of white minority rule. I don't know if you want to get into the weeds discussing that, but people are critical of Israel all the time. But when you say things, when Israel is, let's just say, the only country in the history of the world deemed an occupier after it withdraws, I think there's something wrong with that. When you say there's a draconian blockade, as the New York Times did, when they're the only country in the history of the world supplying their enemies in the middle of a war, there's something wrong with that. Let me point out as well, right after the attack, the October 7 attack, the New York Times did a complete about face, a total 180, and they ran two stories saying the real problem wasn't the draconian blockade. No, no, no. The real problem was Israel let in money from Qatar. It was the Qatari cash. And this built up Hamas somehow, and Netanyahu did it for some evil reason. It's nonsensical. It can't be both a draconian blockade. You can't criticize someone for both imposing a draconian blockade and letting in money. I mean, which one is it? You got to pick one. But when you're the New York Times, the main thing is always making Israel the bad guy. It doesn't matter what the facts are.
Another person who's made your argument is Simon Sebag Montefiore. He had a very influential piece in the Atlantic. He's a man of certainly a liberal, if not a liberal, a left liberal. He wrote a piece in the Atlantic about the decolonization narrative is dangerous and false. He compared actually, and I'm quoting him, I always wondered about the leftist intellectuals who supported Stalin and those aristocratic sympathizers and peace activists who excused Hitler. Do you, like Montefiore, do you believe that supporting Hamas is equivalent to supporting Hitler or Stalin?
Actually, I do. I don't know about Stalin, but I don't think there's any question that Hamas wants to commit genocide. It's not what I say. It is what they say.
Well, you brought up the G word, Uri. I mean, that's another tricky word, isn't it?
Do you think if Hamas had the ability to kill every Jew, do you think they would do it?
Every Jew in the world?
Every Jew in Israel. Of course they would. They've said it. It's in there. It's actually, it's enshrined.
Yeah. I don't know. I think they would kill a lot. I'm not sure
they'd kill everybody. And that's not what I say. That's what they say. And it's also enshrined in their constitution that they want to just wipe out every Jew in Israel. Whether they want to kill every Jew in Israel.
Is that because they think Jews are dogs? And what was the other thing? Monkeys and dogs?
In the Quran that says Jews are the sons of apes and pigs. And they take this literally. Now, again, most Muslims do not. I have no issue with that, but they do. And they say this all the time. And again, it's right there. There's many, many instances of this. I can pull your books right off my shelf behind me.
Yeah, so I assume you're not very keen on the use of the G word, genocide, when it comes to Gaza from the critical point of view. But is this a useful word? I'm always a little ambivalent. I mean, it's an ugly word, of course. You're suggesting that Hamas is genocidal, but not the Israelis. I'm guessing the other side would argue that the Israelis are genocidal, but not Hamas. Is it a helpful word?
I think it's helpful when it's accurate. I mean, we all want to prevent genocide. But just so you understand, I mean, if you look at the population of Gaza, which has gone up exponentially, if anything, it's, Israel's commit genocide in reverse. It's ridiculous. When Israel first got there in 1960.
What does that mean, commit genocide in reverse?
Maybe not a very good one. When Israel got to Gaza in 1967, there were an estimated 300,000 Palestinians there. Today, there's an estimated about 2.1 million. That ain't genocide, okay? We can debate all day long, what it might be. Genocide it is not. They've also exercised a degree of care in preserving enemy civilian life that we certainly haven't in the United States, and Britain hasn't. And this has been acknowledged by American officers. The British Colonel Richard Kemp has said it. The American General Martin Dempsey, he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he has said it. Many of John Spencer, who teaches urban warfare at West Point, he has said it. There's no question. I mean, forgetting everything else, Israel sent ground troops into Gaza, took hundreds of killed, thousands of wounded. We didn't do that. When we wiped out Islamic State, we just sent in our Air Force and flattened every city they had. That's why we killed so many more civilians.
Yeah, maybe your next book should be called, this book was called American Intifada, maybe American Intifada 2.0. The book, when did you write the book, Uri? I'm curious, given what's happened since the Trump re-election, would you have written the same book, given Trump's obsession, it seems, with anti-Semitism? There's an interesting piece by Michelle Goldberg, who I'm guessing you probably think is an anti-Semite, but she's very skeptical of Trump's obsession with anti-Semitism and his attempt to purge the universities. When did you write this book?
I wrote it primarily in the middle of 2024. I finished the first draft in late August. I was able to add a little bit more material in January of 2025. And that's pretty much it. So anything that happened after January of 25 is not going to be in there.
So what's your take on Trump's seeming obsession with anti-Semitism and his attempt to punish universities for enabling anti-Semitism? I know you live in New York. You've been associated with NYU. Of course, Columbia has been the eye of the storm of this controversy.
I think he's been obsessed with something a little bit more subtle than that. It is more what is now in America referred to as woke. Why is it that if a president of a university was asked, would you tolerate the advocacy of genocide against blacks? Everyone would say, of course not. But when asked about genocide of Jews, you got this kind of lawyerly answer, well, it would depend on the context.
But no one, but you're collapsing stuff. No university president has ever prevaricated on the genocide of Jews. It's unthinkable and unimaginable. They'd lose their job in about 10 seconds.
That's exactly what happened. They did prevaricate and they lost their job.
Oh, give me an example. What university president prevaricated on, and I'm using your words, the genocide of Jews?
If you recall Liz McGill and the president of Harvard, I'm having a...
Yeah, but they're not. They may have been ambivalent on it, but again, you're collapsing these arguments. They're not prevaricating on genocide. They may be ambivalent on Israel, but that's another subject.
Well, they were asked about anti-Semitism, and I'll put the question to you. What if they were asked about anti-black violence? Do you think they would have given that answer? And the answer is obvious. Of course they wouldn't. Then they...
But it depends on the context. It depends on many things. But again, you're doing exactly what you're accusing others of doing, of collapsing arguments and of making slightly... I mean, what university president would ever support, especially the genocide of Jews of all people? It's unimaginable.
Well, but they said that whether you could advocate for it on campus depends on the context. And you heard...
Advocate for, but again, I mean, let's talk about the Khalil controversy, the Mahmoud Khalil, the student activist at Columbia, has been thrown out, or Trump people want to throw out of the country. Shouldn't this guy have the right to make his argument, even if we don't much care for what he's saying?
I'm less familiar with the details of that case, to be honest.
You can't be that unfamiliar. This is the dominant case. You've just written a whole book about it. I didn't write
a book about the Khalil case. That happened after the book.
Well, what's your take? I mean, should this guy be thrown out of the country for taking an anti-Israel position on campus?
So if he's taking an anti-Israel position, the answer obviously is no. If he's taking one that suggests violence, then yeah, we don't want people coming to our country and advocating violence. If that's what he advocated. Again, I'm just not up on all the details of the Khalil case. And it did happen after I submitted the book for final publication. So I just didn't have a chance to take a deep dive in it.
But, you know, the idea of advocating violence is such a gray area. I mean, anyone who is in any way sympathetic to Hamas, or at least to the Palestinian politics on the West, in Gaza, they can be accused of being pro-Hamas, so they can all be thrown out. They can all be accused of being terrorists. At what point do we simply have to accept that people like Khalil have the right to express themselves on campus? Isn't that the essence of liberalism, of saying things that we don't much care for?
I understand it. And again, I am far from an expert at this. There was a U.S. Supreme Court case, I think in 1952, raising the question of whether people here on a green card have the same First Amendment rights as American citizens. If you ask me, I think they should, but apparently under the law, that's not clear. That's what, as I understand it. But again, I've never really taken a deep dive into this particular.
Well, let me rephrase the question then. Should this, what you call in the book, American Intifada, should this new anti-Semitism, should it be illegal in America?
Should it be illegal? I don't know how we would define illegal. I mean, it should be illegal.
Well, should you be punished for expressing, for example,
No,
pro-Hamas
absolutely
views?
not. We are Americans. We are outliers when it comes to the First Amendment. As long as you are not inciting violence, and screaming, shouting fire in a theater, it's the old analogy. Anything you say should be completely legal. In that respect, I'm an American. By the way, most countries don't agree with that. And America is very much an outlier. Most countries advocating anti-Semitism is a crime. Germany, I'm pretty sure it is. I think it might be in Britain as well. I'm not sure. I know in America it is not a crime, and it should not be a crime, again, as long as you're not advocating or inciting violence.
You make the argument, and it's an interesting one, but I'm not sure of the logic. You say progressives by definition are hostile to Israel. Some people might say, well, that's because of the politics of Israel, the politics of the Gaza Strip, the politics of the left bank. Of the West Bank. So, are there progressives who are not hostile to Israel? I mean, do you know of any?
Yeah.
And aren't you just sort of playing around with terms here? It's a semantic issue because progressives, by definition, are hostile to countries that, in their mind at least, exploit minorities, powerless minorities.
First of all, that's not always true. But putting that aside, there are many progressives who are very pro-Israel. Richie Torres is one of them. Senator John Fetterman is another. It's just harder for progressives because it requires doing that one thing that we human beings are not very good at, which is thinking outside our box. We all think inside of a box. I certainly do myself. So very often you've got to think outside your box. And when you are used to backing people of color, particularly against white groups of privilege, it's going to be very, very, very hard for you to side with Israel over the Palestinians. But if you get educated and you understand the facts, suddenly it becomes easier. And if you can do that and think outside your box, then yeah, you're going to be pro-Israel, even though you're a progressive. And there are people that are.
Well, you're familiar with the complicated history of the region, to put it mildly, a euphemism. 18 Days in October, as I said, that was your last book. Let's end, Uri, with some thoughts on how to improve the situation. Nobody's in favor of anti-Semitism, certainly none of my guests on this show, and I hope none of our audience. But there is a huge problem. What are the next steps? What needs to happen? I mean, Obama talks in the X piece that I found about peace under Biden. That was a failure. It seems every round of peace negotiations is a failure. The war is continuing. What needs to happen?
Well, there's two questions in there. What needs to happen is between Israelis and Palestinians is real simple. The Palestinians have to agree to accept a Jewish state in the Middle East. If they do that, the war will end, all the suffering will end. That's always been the missing piece in the whole puzzle.
So they've never done that?
Not even once. Never.
I'm not sure everyone would agree with that.
If they're educated, they sure would. They rejected every single compromise proposed.
Saying that if the Palestinians become educated, they'll come around to your way of thinking.
I'd like to think. I hope that's the case. I'm not sure that it is, but hopefully you're right. But I can tell you they even rejected the British White Paper of 1940, which said no Jewish state. And that's because their leader at the time, Hashim Husseini, said, we'd have to live with the Jews as a minority. We don't want that. We want to kill them all. And then he went and joined Hitler in exile. And the views of those.
So is that are they the dog? Was it the dogs and the monkeys again?
Apes and pigs. That's what they said. As far as changing progressives, I think the only way to do it is the same way Martin Luther King changed America. And that's just confronting people with their biases and just pointing out that the things that they think are true aren't necessarily true. And the analogy I always like to give is they say that in World War II, the troop trains carrying German POWs would travel across the American South. And if they stopped in a particular town, the German POWs could eat in the local restaurants because they were white, but the guards very often could not because they were African American. And if you point that out to an American, even a racist is going to say, that's ridiculous. It's absurd. So how does this go on? I'd like to think that we can confront our progressive friends and neighbors and relatives and say, there's one country in the Middle East that respects the rights of homosexuals, and that's Israel. Israel elected its first openly gay politician to the Knesset which is the rough equivalent of the United States Senate. They did this back in December of 1973. Gays have served openly in their military at least since the 1980s. They've had 3 female chief justices of their Supreme Court. They've had a female prime minister.
Okay, so you've made your point. I mean, I asked you, Uri, what needs to change. You said progressives need to change their minds, Palestinians need to change their minds, but Jews, I mean, Zionists don't. That they're doing everything right. That nothing needs to change on that front. That Netanyahu and the current people in power there, that everything's good. And if only the progressives and the Palestinians would change their mind, then everything would be good.
You hit it right on the head, my friend. That is exactly what needs to happen. Benjamin Netanyahu agreed to the 2-state solution 30 years ago. If the Palestinians would only be willing to live in peace with Benjamin Netanyahu in power, there would be a Palestinian state living in peace side by side with Israel. That's what we're all waiting for. You know what? I'm going to give you a little trivia question, okay? Who was the first American president to recognize a Palestinian state? I'll bet you the answer surprises you. Want to take
Abraham Lincoln.
Nice try. Actually, it was George W. Bush. It was the roadmap to peace.
Or you have to, let's see. I have to admit I'm slightly skeptical of what you're saying here, but it's an interesting argument. American Intifada, Israel, the Gaza War, and the new anti-Semitism by an old friend of the show, Uri Kaufman, who has bravely come forward on the show in spite of 5 cracked ribs that he got on the ice rink. Maybe we need, Uri, an ice skating contest between the Palestinians and Israel, and whoever wins would get the land. How about that?
That's one idea, I suppose. We've tried everything else, so why not that? Andrew, it's always fun to come on the show, and this is why. It really is. It's a privilege.
Can I step on the scene?